They called me barren and forced a divorce, then the truth left them speechless. The morning my mother-in-law stood up in front of 200 wedding guests at my husband's cousin's reception, pointed her trembling finger at me, and announced to the entire hall that I was a barren woman who did not deserve to carry the Coulson name, I did not scream, I did not cry, I simply set down my glass of lemonade and smiled, because I already knew something none of them did, and that quiet smile would haunt every single person in that room for the rest of their lives. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the kind of hope that survives even our darkest mornings, and in the power of second chances, I want to ask you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little light today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community grows stronger every time someone chooses compassion over judgment, and stories like this one only reach the people who need them most when we share them together. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, because to understand that morning in the reception hall, you have to understand the woman I used to be. My name is Margaret Coulson, though for most of my life everyone called me Maggie. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, in a modest house with a wraparound porch, raised by a father who repaired tractors for a living and a mother who canned peaches every August and hummed old hymns while she did it. We did not have much money, but we had enough love in that house to make up for it 100 times over. My parents taught me that a person's worth was never measured by what they owned, but by how they treated the people around them, especially the ones who could do nothing for them in return. I carried that lesson with me my entire life, through nursing school, through my first job at a small community hospital, and eventually into the arms of a man named Richard Coulson. I met Richard on a rainy Tuesday in the hospital cafeteria, where he had come to visit his grandmother, who was recovering from a hip surgery I had assisted with earlier that week. He was kind to the nurses, he remembered my name after only hearing it once, and he laughed at a joke I made about the terrible coffee in a way that felt genuine rather than polite. We talked for almost 2 hours that day, long after his grandmother had fallen asleep, and by the time he left, I already knew I wanted to see him again. Richard was not a flashy man. He worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, wore the same brown coat every winter until it nearly fell apart, and believed deeply in doing the right thing even when no one was watching. For the first 2 years of our relationship, I thought I had found the kind of love my parents always told me to wait for, patient and steady and true. We married in a small chapel with white wildflowers lining the aisle, and I remember standing there thinking that nothing could ever break what we had built together. What I did not fully understand yet, what I was only beginning to sense in small uncomfortable moments, was that Richard's family operated by a very different set of rules than the one I had grown up with. His mother, Constance Coulson, was a woman who measured everything, absolutely everything, in terms of legacy, appearance, and the opinions of people she barely knew. She had built her entire identity around the Coulson name, a name that had once belonged to a modestly successful furniture business 3 generations back, and she treated that inheritance as though it were royalty rather than the fading memory of a furniture store that had closed before I was even born. Constance had 2 other children besides Richard, a daughter named Priscilla who mirrored her mother's sharp tongue almost perfectly, and an older son named Gregory who mostly stayed out of the family drama by living 3 states away and visiting only on holidays. From the very beginning, Constance made it clear that she did not think I was good enough for her son. I was a nurse, not a lawyer or a doctor or the daughter of someone important. My family did not have a summer home or a country club membership. I said, "Yes ma'am," instead of correcting people who mispronounced my last name, and I brought casseroles to gatherings instead of ordering catering from the restaurants Constance preferred. None of this seemed to matter to Richard, who often told me privately that he had married me because I made him feel like himself, not like a Coulson performing a role, but simply like a man who was allowed to be ordinary and happy. For the first 3 years of our marriage, that was enough to shield me from his mother's disapproval, or at least to soften its edges. Then came the topic that would eventually unravel everything, the topic of children. Constance began asking about grandchildren before Richard and I had even finished unpacking boxes in our first apartment. At every family dinner, every holiday, every casual phone call, she would find a way to bring up the subject, sometimes gently disguised as concern, sometimes not disguised at all. She would comment on how quickly her friends' daughters-in-law were becoming pregnant, how the Coulson bloodline needed an heir to carry the family name forward, how time was not on my side the way it once had been. I tried to explain to her, gently at first and then more firmly as the years passed, that Richard and I were trying, that these things sometimes took time, that fertility was a private and often painful subject that deserved compassion rather than pressure. Constance did not seem to believe in compassion when it came to matters she considered important, and in her mind, nothing was more important than a grandchild to carry forward the Coulson legacy. 2 years turned into 3, and 3 turned into 5, and still there was no pregnancy. What the family did not know, because Richard had asked me never to share it, was that we had already gone through extensive testing. We had visited 3 different fertility specialists across 2 years, undergone tests that left me physically exhausted and emotionally raw, and endured the quiet grief that comes with hoping and waiting month after month only to be disappointed again. During that time, Richard held my hand through every appointment, every disappointment, every late night when I cried into my pillow so he would not hear me, though of course he always did. He told me repeatedly that it did not matter to him, that he loved me regardless of whether we ever had children, and for a long time I believed those words came from a place that would never change. But something shifts in a person when they are surrounded day after day, year after year, by voices telling them that the woman they love is broken, that she is the reason for the family's unhappiness, that she is standing in the way of something sacred. I watched Richard slowly begin to absorb his mother's poison, drop by drop, the way water erodes stone so gradually that you do not notice until the shape has already changed. He stopped defending me at family dinners the way he once had. He grew quieter when his mother made pointed comments about barren women and empty houses. He began coming home from his mother's house with a tightness in his jaw that had not been there before, and though he never said the cruel things his family said, his silence in those moments cut just as deep, because silence, when someone you love should be speaking up for you, can feel like its own kind of betrayal. It was Priscilla, Richard's sister, who first said the word out loud in front of me, at a birthday dinner for Constance that I had spent 2 full days preparing food for. She had drunk more wine than usual, and somewhere between the appetizers and the cake, she looked directly at me across the table and said that some women were simply not built to be mothers, that nature sometimes made mistakes, and that perhaps it was time for Richard to consider whether he wanted to spend the rest of his life with a barren wife or whether he deserved a chance at the family he had always wanted. The table went silent. I remember my hands trembling in my lap, my face burning with a mixture of humiliation and fury, and I remember looking at Richard, waiting for him to say something, anything, to defend the woman he had promised to love in sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow. He said nothing. He simply stared down at his plate and asked his sister to pass the salt, as though she had commented on the weather instead of tearing open one of the deepest wounds of my life in front of his entire family. I left that dinner early, drove home alone in the dark because Richard stayed behind to smooth things over with his mother, and I sat in our driveway for nearly an hour before I found the strength to walk inside. That night marked the beginning of something I could not yet name, a slow crumbling that would eventually bring our marriage to its knees. Over the following months, the comments grew bolder and more frequent. Constance began inviting eligible young women to family gatherings, women she introduced as friends of Priscilla's, though it did not take a genius to understand what she was doing. She would seat these women next to Richard, praise their childbearing hips in language just subtle enough to maintain deniability, and watch me with a look that made it clear she was measuring my reaction, hoping I would break down or lash out so she could paint me as unstable in addition to barren. I did not break down in front of them, not once, though there were nights I broke down completely once I was alone, sitting on the bathroom floor with the shower running so Richard would not hear me weeping. I kept working my nursing shifts, kept caring for patients who had no idea that the woman changing their bandages and adjusting their medication was carrying a private grief of her own, kept coming home to a husband who grew more distant with each passing week. I began to feel like a ghost haunting my own marriage, present in the house but increasingly absent from Richard's heart, which seemed to be slipping further into his mother's grip with every visit. The breaking point came on a warm Saturday afternoon in June, at the wedding reception of Richard's cousin Beatrice. The reception was held in a beautiful rented hall with tall windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light, round tables draped in ivory linen, and a live band playing soft music while guests mingled with champagne glasses in hand. I remember wearing a pale blue dress that Richard had once told me made my eyes look like the ocean, and I remember trying, despite everything, to smile and participate in the celebration, because Beatrice had always been kind to me and I did not want to ruin her day with the tension simmering beneath the surface of the Coulson family. Constance had been drinking more than usual, emboldened by champagne and the celebratory atmosphere, and at some point during the reception, she stood up near the head table, tapped her glass with a spoon to gather attention under the pretense of offering a toast to the newlyweds, and instead turned the moment into something else entirely. She began by congratulating Beatrice and her new husband, praising the beautiful life they would build together, the children they would surely have to carry the family forward. Then, without warning, her eyes shifted to me, sitting quietly at a nearby table, and her voice grew sharper, louder, carrying across the entire hall as she declared that not every Coulson wife had been so blessed, that some had brought only disappointment and emptiness into this family, that a barren woman had no place carrying a name meant for generations of children. The room fell into a horrified silence. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes turning toward me, some out of pity, some out of shock, a few, I am ashamed to admit, out of the same cruel curiosity that makes people slow down at car accidents. I sat there for a long moment, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks, feeling the old familiar urge to shrink, to apologize for existing, to disappear into the tablecloth. And then something inside me shifted, something that had been quietly gathering strength through years of silent suffering, because unlike everyone else in that room, I knew something Constance did not know, something Richard himself did not fully know, something that would change everything. I set down my glass of lemonade with deliberate calm, rose from my chair, smoothed the front of my blue dress, and smiled, not the tight, wounded smile of a woman trying to hold herself together, but a genuine, knowing smile, the kind that comes from a place of quiet certainty. I looked directly at Constance and told her, in a voice steady enough to carry across the silent hall, that she was welcome to her opinions, but that the truth had a way of revealing itself in its own time, and that she might want to be careful about the things she said so confidently in front of so many witnesses. Then I turned, walked calmly out of that reception hall with my head held high, and drove myself home, leaving Richard behind to deal with the aftermath of his mother's cruelty. That night, when he finally returned home, he did not apologize for his mother's words. Instead, sitting across from me at our kitchen table with a face full of exhaustion and something that looked almost like relief, he told me that perhaps his mother was right, that perhaps it was time for us to consider a divorce, that he deserved the chance to have the family he had always dreamed of, and that he could not keep watching me suffer through years of failed attempts when the problem might never resolve itself. I want you to imagine, for a moment, what it feels like to hear the person you have loved for 7 years, the person who once held your hand through every disappointment, calmly suggest that your marriage should end because your body has not produced the child his family demands. I want you to imagine the particular kind of heartbreak that comes not from anger, but from watching someone you love slowly become a stranger, shaped by the poison of people who never truly valued you in the first place. I did not scream that night. I did not beg him to reconsider. I simply asked him one question, quietly, across that kitchen table, and I asked him whether he had ever, in all our years of testing and appointments and waiting rooms, actually looked closely at his own test results, or whether he had simply assumed, as his mother had taught him to assume, that the failure belonged entirely to me. Richard's face changed in that moment, a flicker of confusion crossing his features, because the truth was that throughout our entire fertility journey, it had been Constance who insisted, repeatedly and forcefully, that the problem must lie with me, that Coulson men had never struggled to father children in the history of the family, that the issue simply could not be on his side. And because Richard had grown up under his mother's influence his entire life, he had absorbed that assumption without ever truly questioning it, even as our doctors had explained, gently and repeatedly, that fertility challenges could originate from either partner, or from a combination of factors, or sometimes from causes that medical science could not fully explain. I told him that night that before he signed any divorce papers, before he let his mother's cruelty define the ending of our marriage, he owed it to both of us to revisit that final specialist appointment we had scheduled months earlier and never completed, because I believed, with a certainty I could not fully explain even to myself, that the truth was more complicated than anyone in his family wanted to admit. He agreed, reluctantly, more out of exhaustion than genuine curiosity, to attend one final appointment with Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, the fertility specialist who had been overseeing our case for the past year. I remember sitting in that waiting room, my hands folded in my lap, watching Richard flip through a magazine without actually reading it, both of us wrapped in a heavy silence that neither of us knew how to break. When Dr. Whitmore called us back into her office, she pulled up both our full medical histories on her computer screen, cross-referencing test results that had been sitting in our file for months, results that, in the chaos and heartbreak of our deteriorating marriage, neither of us had taken the time to fully review together. What she told us that afternoon changed everything. She explained, with the careful compassion of a doctor who had delivered difficult news many times before, that my own reproductive health was, in fact, completely normal, that every test I had undergone showed no barriers to conception on my end whatsoever. The complication, she explained gently, turning her screen toward Richard, lay in a condition he had never been tested for until our very last round of appointments, a condition affecting sperm motility that made natural conception significantly more difficult, though not impossible with the right medical intervention. She explained that this was not something Richard could have known about without proper testing, that it was not his fault any more than it would have been mine had the situation been reversed, but that the assumption made so confidently by his family, the assumption that had shaped years of blame and cruelty directed entirely at me, had been wrong from the very beginning. I watched Richard's face in that office, watched the color drain from it as the weight of that information settled over him, watched 7 years of his mother's accusations and his sister's cruel comments and his own gradual retreat from defending me collapse under the simple, undeniable truth revealed in a folder of medical records. He did not say anything for a long moment. Dr. Whitmore, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding, quietly excused herself to give us privacy, and Richard sat there in that small office, staring at the floor, his shoulders trembling in a way I had not seen since his father's funeral years earlier. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were full of tears, and he began apologizing, not in the careful, calculated way people apologize when they are trying to save face, but in the raw, broken way people apologize when they finally understand the true scope of the pain they have allowed to happen. I want to pause here and say something important, because I know some of you listening to this story might expect me to have walked away in that moment, to have told Richard that his apology came too late, that 7 years of silent suffering could not be undone by a single revelation in a doctor's office. And I understand that reaction completely, because there were certainly moments in the months that followed when anger rose up in me like a wave I could barely contain. But I also believe, deeply and completely, that forgiveness is not about excusing the pain someone has caused you, but about choosing not to let that pain define the rest of your life, and about recognizing when a person is truly, genuinely capable of change rather than simply sorry they got caught. Richard did not ask me to simply forget what had happened. Instead, over the following weeks, he did something I had never seen him do before in all our years together. He stood up to his mother. He drove to her house alone, without me, and told her everything Dr. Whitmore had explained, laid out the medical truth in plain, unflinching terms, and watched his mother's face as the foundation of years of cruelty crumbled in front of her. According to Richard, Constance's first reaction was not shame or remorse, but denial, a desperate insistence that the doctors must be mistaken, that a Coulson man could not possibly be the source of such a problem. But Richard, for the first time in his life, refused to back down. He told her that regardless of what she believed, he knew the truth now, and that the years of cruelty she had directed at his wife, cruelty he had allowed to happen through his own cowardly silence, were inexcusable and would not continue. The confrontation that followed was not gentle. Constance accused Richard of choosing me over his own family, of being manipulated, of betraying the Coulson legacy she had spent her entire life protecting. Priscilla, when she learned the truth, initially tried to minimize what had happened, suggesting that everyone said things they did not mean when they were drinking, that I should simply move past it because that was what families did. But something had shifted in Richard that could not be undone. He told his mother and sister, calmly but firmly, that if they could not find it in themselves to apologize to me, genuinely and completely, for the years of cruelty they had inflicted, then he would step back from the family entirely, that he would no longer attend gatherings that excluded me, that he would no longer allow his wife to be treated as anything less than the woman he had promised to honor and protect on our wedding day. I will admit that when Richard first told me about this confrontation, I did not fully believe it would lead to lasting change. I had watched him fold under his mother's pressure too many times before to trust that this moment of courage would hold. But over the following months, Richard proved, through consistent action rather than empty promises, that something fundamental had shifted within him. He accompanied me to my nursing shifts sometimes, just to have lunch together during my breaks. He began attending couples counseling with me, not because a therapist told him he had to, but because he genuinely wanted to understand how his silence had contributed to my pain, and how he could become the kind of husband who would never again let fear of his mother's disapproval outweigh his loyalty to his wife. He researched fertility treatments extensively, discovered specialists who worked specifically with cases like his own, and approached the entire process not as a burden he was reluctantly accepting, but as a journey he wanted to walk through together with me, as equal partners rather than a broken woman and her disappointed husband. Constance, for her part, did not change overnight, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one sometimes make transformation seem easier and more complete than it actually is in real life. For nearly a year, she remained distant, cold, unwilling to acknowledge the harm she had caused. She skipped several family gatherings rather than face me, and when we did cross paths at events neither of us could avoid, the tension between us remained thick enough to cut with a knife. I did not push her to reconcile faster than she was ready for, because I had learned, through my own painful journey, that genuine change cannot be forced, only invited and given space to grow. The real turning point came almost 18 months after that devastating reception, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon when Constance showed up unannounced at our front door, standing on our porch with her hands trembling and her eyes red from crying, something I had genuinely never witnessed in all the years I had known her. She asked if she could come in, and when I stepped aside to let her through, she sat down at our kitchen table, the same table where Richard had once suggested our divorce, and she told me, in a voice stripped of all its usual sharpness and pride, that she had spent months reflecting on the woman she had become, the mother she had been, the poison she had allowed to spread through her family in the name of protecting a legacy that, in the end, meant nothing if it cost her the people she was supposed to love. She told me she had grown up in a household where her own worth had been measured entirely by her ability to produce children and maintain appearances, that her own mother had made her feel disposable during a difficult pregnancy years before I ever entered the family, and that somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that inflicting that same pain on others was simply the way families operated, a cycle she had never questioned until she saw it reflected back at her in the devastated face of her own son. She apologized to me that afternoon, fully and without excuses, for the cruel words at the reception, for the years of pressure and blame, for inviting other women to family gatherings in an attempt to replace me, for every small and large cruelty she had inflicted in the name of a legacy that meant far less than the family she had nearly destroyed. I sat across from her, this woman who had once called me Barren in front of 200 people, and I felt something unexpected rise up in me, not triumph, not vindication, but a quiet, aching compassion for a woman who had clearly been shaped by her own unhealed wounds she had never had the courage or the tools to address until they had cost her almost everything. I told her that I forgave her, not because what she had done was acceptable, but because I believed, watching her genuine grief and remorse in that moment, that she was capable of becoming someone better, and because I did not want to spend the rest of my life carrying the weight of that anger when I had the choice to set it down instead. Forgiveness, I have come to understand, is not a single moment but a practice, something you choose again and again, especially on the harder days when old wounds ache in ways you did not expect. Over the following 2 years, Constance slowly rebuilt her relationship with both Richard and me, showing up not with grand gestures, but with small, consistent acts of genuine care, remembering my birthday without being reminded, asking thoughtful questions about my nursing work instead of dismissing it, defending me without hesitation when a distant relative made an insensitive comment at a holiday gathering. Priscilla's transformation took longer and remained less complete, though she too, in her own imperfect way, began treating me with a respect she had never shown before. Richard and I continued our fertility journey together during this time, and I want to share, because I believe hope deserves to be spoken aloud, that after nearly a year of treatment tailored specifically to address the condition Dr. Whitmore had identified, I became pregnant. I remember sitting in the bathroom of our home, staring at a positive test result with hands that would not stop shaking, and I remember calling Richard into the room, watching him fall to his knees on the tile floor and weep, not the tears of a man whose family legacy had finally been secured, but the tears of a man who had walked through years of darkness with the woman he loved and had finally arrived at a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. Our daughter was born on a bright September morning, and we named her Eleanor, after the doctor whose careful, thorough work had uncovered a truth that changed the entire trajectory of our family. I remember holding her for the first time in the hospital room, this tiny, perfect person who represented not just the child we had longed for, but the survival of a marriage that had nearly been destroyed by cruelty, assumption, and silence. Constance was there in the waiting room that day, and when she finally held her granddaughter for the first time, I watched tears stream down a face that had once looked at me with such contempt, and I understood, in that moment, that people are capable of profound transformation when they are given the space, the truth, and the grace to change. I think often about that afternoon in the reception hall, about the woman I was in that moment, humiliated in front of 200 strangers and family members alike, and I think about how easy it would have been to let that humiliation define the rest of my story. I think about how many women, in situations similar to mine, are made to feel broken, blamed, and discarded for circumstances entirely beyond their control, circumstances that medical science often reveals to be far more complicated than the simple, cruel narratives families sometimes construct around them. I think about how important it is to seek truth before accepting judgment, to ask questions before allowing silence to calcify into permanent damage, and to remember that the people who hurt us most are often carrying their own unhealed wounds, wounds that do not excuse their cruelty, but that sometimes explain the desperate, misguided ways they try to protect themselves from facing their own pain. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own journey through heartbreak toward healing, or of a relationship you once thought was beyond repair, I want you to take a moment before we close this story together and leave a comment below sharing what this story meant to you, or perhaps a moment in your own life when the truth finally set something right that judgment had nearly destroyed. Your words matter to this community, and they matter to the people who will read this story after you and find comfort in knowing they are not alone in their struggles. Today, our family gathers every Sunday for dinner, the same family that once made me feel like an outsider unworthy of the Colson name. Constance now spends her afternoons teaching Eleanor how to bake the same pies she once used to impress guests she considered more worthy than me, and there is a tenderness in the way she speaks to her granddaughter that heals something in me every time I witness it. Richard and I recently celebrated our 12th wedding anniversary, and though our marriage bears the scars of what nearly broke it, I believe those scars have made the love between us stronger and more honest than it ever was before, because we built our way back to each other not through denial or forced forgetting, but through truth, accountability, and the daily choice to keep showing up for one another with open hearts. I share this story not to condemn the people who hurt me, though the pain they caused was real and deep, but to offer something I wish someone had told me during those years of silent suffering, that the truth has its own timing, that your worth is never determined by another person's assumptions about your body or your circumstances, and that even the deepest wounds inflicted by the people who are supposed to love us most can, with time, honesty, and genuine remorse, become the very foundation upon which a stronger, more authentic love is built. If you believe, as I have come to believe, that hope survives even our darkest chapters, that forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves as much as anyone else, and that second chances, when earned through real change, can transform even the most broken families into something whole again, then please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone in your life who might need these words today, leave a comment telling us what this story means to you, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of resilience, truth, and the quiet, unshakable power of hope.